There you go. So, class 16. I got 2 chapters, one of which, again, like last time, is more just information, not a lot of coding, and then the other one's more coding. Main things that we're learning today, standard format for exchanging data across the internet, as of right now, is JSON. It used to be XML. So you might see that as somewhere. I think it references it as like an AJAX, which is the X is XML. That is something that still is used, but not very often. Almost everybody uses JSON now. We're going to talk about rules of JSON format, what an API is, how to use fetch, and then how to actually use the data that's returned, and then the differences between synchronous and asynchronous. So the first chapter was JSON. These are just main vocabulary rules and rules of going over. So the whole reason we have an API is when one computer talks to another computer, we need to know how to exchange information between the two. And that's what the API is for. Such as if you go to google.com and actually search, you're going to type in a text box, and that's GUID, like a graphical user interface. That's for users to use, and it's graphical. It's pretty. It's you can obviously see your text box. You can see your search button. All those kind of things. You could technically search. I don't know about Google, but you can search different things and interact with the computer. A user, a person to a computer can interact using a command line interface. So remember, the eyes on all of those are interface. It's how you interact. It's that agreed upon interaction, so you can get what you want. Meaning a CLI, one thing is PowerShell. If I just type random things into PowerShell, it's not going to know what I mean. It's not going to do what I want it to do. I have to learn and abide by the rules that somebody programmed into PowerShell for it to actually do what I want. That's no different than what we're referring to here with an API. The only difference is you are not interacting with another computer. You're coding one computer to interact with another computer. So those computers need to know, well, I'm going to request information, I'm going to get information, and how do those computers talk to each other? And that's this application programming interface. So it's how to program it so that they can talk to each other. We do this in JavaScript using fetch, which is a method that's built into JavaScript that helps us go request information from something. Whenever we send, which it didn't talk a lot about sending JSON, but you can, using post methods, which it also didn't talk a lot about, but you can. You can send JSON, you can send XML, you can send form, you can send queries. That's what we usually do, the string queries at the end inside the URL. So there's different ways to send the information you want. And then it usually returns in a JSON format. It could technically return in almost any format, but most APIs by standard now return a JSON format, which stands for the JavaScript Object Notation. So it's just, how are we notating? How are we writing down so that whenever we get this back, we know what it looks like, what the structure is, so then we can do something about it. When you're writing JSON, it is key value pair. Your key has to be a string. Some people were asking about this before. There's the JSON, which is JavaScript Object Notation. But then whenever we're actually just creating objects with JavaScript, which are JavaScript objects, but we're not using the JSON notation, we're just doing JavaScript objects, our key is actually not a string, it's a variable. And remember, variables, we don't put we don't put quotes around. But the JSON, the notation rules are, when we declare a key value, we're going to put quotes around it every time. Your value, though, can be a number, a string, Boolean array, object. Technically, it could be null. Your value is going to be your value. So you don't have to have quotes around your value. If you use quotes, they are pretty strict about using double quotes. You don't want to use single quotes with JSON. and then that last point is kind of what I talked about. So that it's based on JavaScript objects, but there are some syntax differences, and the JSON syntax is a little bit more strict, mainly with those double quotes. You cannot use single quotes, and the key has to be a string. Just checking the chat as we do this. All right. Here's an example from the book, JSON versus JavaScript object. Remember, JSON, the first 3 letters stand for JavaScript object. So it is very confusing whenever you're reading through this. That's why we either say JavaScript object or we say JSON, just to clarify the two. These are proper cases of using JSON and then a JavaScript object. Again, the double quotes. This one, the keys do not have quotes. And the second part, which is more of the programming part, well, we talked about this JSON object, you know, what do we use it for? And that's using these fetch. So the fetch function, it needs to have 2 things. It needs a URL that it's going to hit. And then it also needs a response handler, which is a function. So an example URL is the one that they gave us from the book with the weather. The response handler, you can write function, parentheses, response, brackets. I think in my examples, whenever I was doing it, I used the arrow notation, arrow function. So just know that you can do it either way. That's a great question. I've always seen them be anonymous functions. I've not tried it with a named function, but I've always seen them, because usually you don't use this function over and over again. So you usually name a function when you're going to use it over and over again. Not just use it over and over, but you're going to use it in multiple places. If you're just going to use a function once in one location, oftentimes JavaScript, and a JavaScript, not framework, the typical person writing JavaScript would always do an inline function or an anonymous function if that's the only place you're going to use it. Other languages like Java, usually they don't want you to write anonymous functions unless if it is a very specific case. Usually they do want you to write a named function and throw it in. So different languages have their like programming etiquette, I guess. So I've always seen this with an anonymous function. They did talk about how to view the request with the developer tools. So we'll also do that during the live coding, going to that developer tools, going to the network, and then being able to see the request and the response. And then the response object, when we get the response object, now I do want to highlight, this is a variable name. They wrote out the whole word response. To be honest, my go-to is res. I usually see res, which is a shortcut for response. That's how I write it, and that's what I see. I've seen some as short as R. I would not go that route because R could stand for too much. But res is a very typical variable. And then whatever this variable name is, that's what you use right here. So these have to match. That's the main key there, is making sure that those match. And then the JSON actually changes it into a JSON object. And then the then means, well, what are you going to do after you get the JSON from there? What are you going to do after that? So this is how you kind of grab that response object. I'm trying to check the chat as I go through, sorry. Industry standards, yeah. I think my problem is I'm not a front-end developer. I just copy and paste what other people do. So I don't want to go as far as industry standards on some of it, or definitely when you get a job, just make sure that you do what they do. They'll tell you. after you grab the response, you usually want to do something with the response. Usually, we want to display it. Well, to display it, we have to actually access the DOM and throw the response into the DOM so that you can see it, the users can see it. So it does show you how to grab, using the document.getElementById. You can grab the document object, and then you can use the inner HTML that actually changes the HTML of that object. I don't think the book talks about this, but one thing that I do often is I do a JSON.stringify. This thing turns the JSON into a string. This is not always needed for what you guys are doing for coding, but remember, my background is I'm very, very good at debugging. So for you guys, this would be my debugging tip for you guys, is to learn how to output, and I'll show that during my live coding, output your JSON to a string, because I don't know if any of you actually tried to put just throw the JSON object as a whole rather than doing JSON dot weather, whatever the key is. If you just do JSON, it says object whenever you display it. If you do this JSON.stringify and display that, it'll actually display the whole entire text as a string. So really good for debugging. It did talk about asynchronous versus synchronous. The short answer is, this is more or less a vocabulary. Asynchronous is the opposite, is you ask it and you aren't waiting for the response back. Where synchronous, it says, if I do this, then the next step is this, and the next step is this. Where asynchronous says, go do this, and whenever I get a response back, then I'll handle it. So asynchronous allows for some wait time in between, which promises are how JSON does asynchronous. In Java, it's called futures. So in Java, we have a future class, which is very, very similar to a promise class in JavaScript. And I can set up, hey, I'm going to give you something later, hold the spot for it. And that's exactly what this promise does, is as it goes through the code, it says, hey, I'm going to give you a response back, but you're going to have to kind of wait on it. You're just trusting me that I'm going to give it back to you, and then you're going to run it after you get it, which then the .then waits for that, and then actually grabs it after it comes back. So the promise is just a placeholder. It's promising that it's going to give you something, and then the then function is the thing that handles once it actually does come back. This copy pasted out of the textbook. So how Fetch works, you do fetch, you paste in the URL, and the URL gets passed to fetch as a parameter. So you put in the HTTP. Unless you say otherwise, it uses the GET request to be sent out to the API. Wherever the HTTP request is, it goes out there. And then the API processes the request, sends back a response. So go get the weather. It's going to wait for the response. Once that response comes back, it uses the then statement to execute what you're going to do with whatever that data is. So it gave you some weather data. Now, what do you want to do with it? Do you want to display it? Do you want to calculate? Do you want to, what do you want to do? Then the anonymous response handler calls the function response, and then the function deals with that data, whatever you told it to do. Based on the code, and the web page gets updated using the DOM method. So fetch doesn't actually call the DOM. That's what you're putting inside there. You don't actually have to use the DOM in a fetch. You don't have to. But for the purposes that we are doing, we want to display that information up to the user. So that's why we're using the DOM. So we went through all of that stuff. To reiterate, Jamarco said that the graded assignments technically due today. That's the HTML, CSS one. To be honest, I have not looked at assignment 5 yet. So I will be getting, I'll talk more about assignment 5 on Thursday. I'll come back and do the studio. Of course, I'm always worried about my real estate here. I'm going to be switching back and forth. Since on my big screens, I usually have this on one side and then the browser on the other side. But you guys will be seeing this flip back and forth quite a bit. So just know that's going to be happening. Hopefully it doesn't cause anybody any headaches. Okay, couple things that I want to show. This is from the chapter examples. So this is a great starting point for whatever you want to do. You have an HTML. I'm just going over basics again. You have an HTML opening and closing. That's telling the browser this is an HTML document. This doc type is saying that it's a specific version. You have the head. In this case, the head contains what kind of char set you want to use, which is fine. The title, remember this is what gets displayed way up here. And I don't know how to make the tab bigger, but this launch status is up here at the top on the tab. That's where this title is. This script is loaded into the DOM right here. And then that completes the head. And then the body, it has an H1 tag that says launch status, which is this thing. It has weather conditions. Do you see how that doesn't have any tag at all? So this is whatever you don't have to actually tag anything. It'll just display. I can wrap this in a paragraph. I could wrap it in an H5 if I wanted to, whatever you want to do there. And then it has a div, which is a division, which is just an open tag. You can do whatever you want to here. What they did was they identified your div with an ID called weather conditions, which based on this, I guess it already loaded. Okay, so a couple different things that I want to show. Well, let's go into the script and then I'm going to show you some things. All right, the script here has a window add listener for load. This is ensuring that your window loads fully before it runs and loads all of this stuff. So once the window loads, it does the fetch that it was talking about. It has this URL that we have to have. It calls out to the URL and it waits. It actually doesn't wait. It says, go call this thing, and it keeps going. There's nothing else in here for it to do. So it just waits until this comes back. Again, if you want to do this, you can do function response. Because this is on a different line, I'm going to pull it over here so that I can have more real estate. What you could do is instead of saying function response, you can do an arrow function like this. I've seen that before. Again, you could put this in parentheses just to make it easier. I like doing this just because it calls it out a little bit more in my eyesight. Like I can see that it's wrapped, so it must be a parameter coming in. And then this response is used here. So the fetch goes out to this URL. It gets an answer, and the answer is this. So this is the answer that it gets from this URL. And then it takes that answer, and we know that this answer is a JSON. So we're going to run this JSON to say, hey, change it to a JSON. And it actually changes the body of the response. The response actually has like a head, a body, a couple different attributes to it, a status code. So it grabs just the body and changes the body into a JSON. And just like the one above, you could say JSON. You can make it whatever you want to. You can make this an arrow function like that. It doesn't change anything. But this is what gets returned from the response body getting changed into a JSON. So this is the response body in JSON form. So then we go and we get the weather conditions ID. So it goes down here and it says, hey, this is my div that I'm talking about. And then I'm going to change the inner HTML. So it's going, everything in this green right there, it's going to put this inside of it. And this is the JSON.temp, JSON.windspeed, JSON.status, JSON.chance of precipitation. And that's how we get these things. So chance of precipitation is 20. Now, if I do this inspect element and go to the network, and I'm going to re-hit this, I can actually see that it goes and calls this weather JSON, and I know this is itty bitty, so I'm going to try to make it a little bit bigger. This is what it does. This is where it goes. It sends a request URL to the thing that we just talked about. It's the method of get. The status code is 200. That means it works. And there's all this other stuff. One important thing that is typical in browsers, but as you develop APIs, if this is not a JSON, you need to put JSON here, this content type. Most of the time it's built into functions anymore, but just so you know, it sometimes you have to type that in. Sorry, I'm trying to read in. What I like to do is I like to look at the response. Do you see how it says temperature, temperature, wind speed, status, sunny? So let's say that I wanted to put in the min and max temperature. Let's go ahead and add those in. So I can just take my, add some here. This would be like current temp. This would be low temp, high temp. And then I need to make sure I got these are case sensitive. So make sure. So then when I save this and I go back to my HTML, now I have low temp of 50, high temp of 71. I was able to get that from these. I could put zip code. I could do something like this to make it say %. These are the things that, like, that's the whole reason I got that image right at the beginning. It was like, LaunchCode can teach you a little bit, but just playing around with this, practicing it, and then trying to find it, every single one of you that I've talked to are always so inquisitive about, well, what if we did this? And I think some of you are still afraid to just, instead of, asking and seeing, just do it. just do it, break it. That's fine. And then and then keep playing around with it. So keep just throwing things in there. Good question, Micah. Can you iterate through these? And you actually can. I didn't have enough time to do that. I was going to research that specific question because that's how I work. Is I like to loop through things. I will actually. I'm going to write it down right now. I will show you that on Thursday. There you go. So I will make sure that I give you an example of how to loop through there. But the problem is, in a realistic world, you're not going to loop through these because oftentimes the APIs give you too much information, or they don't put it in the format that you want. So just like I wanted this % at the end. So in a perfect world, the API, like if you guys built the API and you're calling the API, then you can do whatever you want to, and then you probably would do something like a loop. But sometimes you're going to want to add or parse or change the information just slightly, such as putting a % at the end. And if you loop through this, this would be hard to do. So you don't always loop, but I'm almost positive you can, and you would do the key with the value here. You have to change this into not a JSON object with notation. You'd have to change this into an object, which I think it already does before you do this thing. I think I could get it figured out, but not right here live. So yes, you can just do a console log and do that. Well, kind of. So I'll show you that now. So let's say I'm going to do the console log here, and I'm going to say JSON, because that's the object that it's passing back. So then whenever I go, when I go here and I go to my console, as you can see, it does give me that. So then, yes, you can do it here. I'm trying to think of anything else. Just to show you a little bit from the order of things. I'm going to put some console logs in here. So I know at this point, if I'm inside this event listener, the page is loaded. So I know that. If I am outside this window, I don't know if I've loaded yet. I don't know yet. If I'm inside this response, then I know that I have the JSON. And then I'm going to get rid of this console log just because it's not going to help me with what I'm showing. So I have 3 console logs that I put in. The page is loaded inside this event listener. I have, I got a response here. And then outside the fetch. So I have my fetch. Nope. Where's it at? I think it's this one. I don't know why it didn't close the way that I wanted it to. Okay, so you have your fetch here and your response. And so this console log is outside the fetch. That's what I want to show you is, okay, so I have a console log here inside the event listener. I have a console log outside. This one says page is loaded. This one's asking if the page is loaded outside. And then I have a console log inside the response here that says that I got a response, but then outside of it, I'm asking when I'm going to get a response. And let's see the order of these console logs. And of course, is page loaded? Page is loaded. When am I getting a response? I got a response. So the whole reason I'm doing this is the order. This add event listener on load. This thing doesn't run until it's loaded. So it adds an event and it actually prints this log not before it adds the event. The event listener is loaded first. The listener, that's the event. So the window, so this thing is added to the code, but because the page has not been loaded yet, it doesn't run until it's loaded. So this log actually gets ran before all the code gets loaded, before the window gets loaded. That's why this gets printed before this thing. But just like that, it's waiting for this one's waiting for an event. Your fetch is waiting for a response because it's a promise. So that response, it actually calls out and does this fetch before it calls this fetch before it actually prints this log. But because it doesn't get the response back as fast as code can run on my computer, this log actually gets printed before the response is returned back from the API. Then it gets the response back. So it's waiting on the response before it continues on through this code. So I don't know if that helps anybody or not, but just know that in JavaScript, especially when you're doing asynchronous, which is this fetch and then, but then also on top of that, JavaScript has it's event driven. So it'll load the code, but it won't actually run the code until that event happens. So this one is not technically asynchronous because it doesn't wait until whenever. It actually runs on an event, which is load. And then it synchronously runs. But then right here, this fetch runs. It does line 8, it does line 9 and 10. But when it gets to this then, that part of the code waits. And it keeps going. It keeps doing all the rest of the code. So that's why oftentimes JavaScript developers have to like rethink how they do things, because if you're needing this response and somewhere down later in the code, like in your HTML, you are expecting that already to have happened. Sometimes there's syncing issues. So just kind of have that in the back of your mind. Everything that we're doing does that for you, meaning you're catching this then before you're writing it. But you could technically write it before you wait for it, and then it just reloads it afterwards. So just, I guess, don't overthink that. But if you follow these step-by-step guides, you'll be fine. Yeah, the internet's so fast that you see the response almost instantaneously. I wish I could like more or less turn off my internet, like hit this thing and show you that, yeah, you're not getting a response back immediately. So there's a difference between immediate and really, really fast. There's also a difference between it waiting for a response before it keeps going, meaning if all of this code was synchronous, it would actually fetch, wait for the response, fill out the JSON before it wrote this line. If it was truly synchronous, if everything between 9 and 28 was synchronous, whenever I ran and did this, I got a response is on line 14, where when I'm asking, did I get a response on line 28? So if it was synchronous, these two would be flip-flopped. A task queue, kind of, yep. It's kind of almost like threading. Yeah, JavaScript, because it doesn't know if it's going to take 1 millisecond or 1,000 milliseconds to get back, it just knows when I get this back, handle it. But it could be like 1 millisecond. So to the human eye, when I hit this, it comes up. It comes up fast enough. This is a good response time. When I go to network, it tells me that it took 2 milliseconds and 49 milliseconds. It tells me the time that it took. And this is so fast to the human eye or to our normal thing, then it's fine. If this was, 2,000 milliseconds, which would be like 2 full seconds, then we would start seeing, well, did my thing load properly? Or how did this code affect something downstream? So So great question. What's the difference between, I wish I could. What's the difference between, so my script right now is in my head. What's the difference between having this up here versus could I just put it down here and then I don't need to do the onload? And I'll be very honest with you. Whenever your HTML loads, yes, it usually loads top to bottom most of the time. Whenever I go and I say, hey, go grab this HTML from google.com or launchcode.com, and it goes and grabs the HTML, it's going to send it in packets. It's not going to send it as one file. It's going to send it in 32 files, all text. And those 32 files come in, and they're very small. That's why they're so fast. They're very small. And then my browser puts them in order real fast. Now, launchcode.com is going to send them in order. It's going to send packet 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. But my computer may or may not actually get them all at the same time. So it depends on the routes that they go. Most of the time, the routes are the same. Usually, if there's no congestion, the routes will just go, all the packets will go to the same route, but sometimes not. So sometimes if it gets a certain packet that it thinks it can load before a previous one, it'll just try to load it in the browser. So you are not 100% guaranteed that if you put a script at the end of the body that it'll actually wait until everything's loaded. 99%, I don't even know the percentage, but I'm going to say 99% of the time it will. But this thing here on load guarantees it. So you don't have to worry about it. Yeah, so whenever it purposely does asynchronous functions, it'll wait for the time to do it. That wasn't, I'm not explaining with the right words that I want to. When you guys were talking about stack, if you're doing straight, maybe there is a way to see the stack. In Java, I know how to do it. In JavaScript, and using the debugger, I know how to see the stack. I don't know how to see the stack per se in here. I know they have a debug. I don't even know where it is on this thing, but they do have some debugging tools in here. You might be able to see that. Yeah, and the other hard part is once it exits the stack, it forgets about it. So unfortunately, unless if you're in debug mode and pause it, and then you can see in what order it is, you won't always know what order it is. Because once it runs, it clears it. So that's the whole, preserving as much memory space as possible. So once it doesn't need it anymore, it just gets rid of it. Right. Right. Let me try to figure out something else. The fetch planets. Okay, let's go to here. So several questions were on this. I want to make sure this runs right. So I'm going to, I think I just copied and pasted it. So whenever you click here, it does these things. Okay, so I have it working. I copied and pasted most of this. I did not edit hardly anything at all. This is where I was trying to do the console log. I'm not going to do that again for you because we did it over there. It does it the same way. I'm going to get rid of all that. Okay, so it goes to the planets. It grabs the stuff. Again, you can do functions or you can do arrow functions. It does not matter. It gets the element by ID, which is the destination. And then it throws in this into the inner HTML. Yep. So let's think about, I am going to talk about this index here in a second. So I will handle that separately. Yeah, I'll show you the stringify. So let's say, this is a horrible example for this, but let's say I didn't really know these other things here. If I just did JSON right here, so underneath by planet, it's going to throw that whole entire JSON object right there. Do you see how it says object, 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 object? This isn't very helpful for me. So if I do JSON capital, no, there we go. If I do JSON.stringify and then throw in, remember this is lowercase JSON only because I named it up here. So I'm going to say this is, I'm going to rename this so that we don't keep getting confused about that. So I changed all of my lowercase JSONs to JSON response, just so you know that it can be something different. When I go here and I click on this, now it actually stringifies everything. So that's what I was talking about with the stringify. It takes your object and it turns it into just one big, huge string with the whole entire response. Again, this is not good for looks. This looks horrible, but it's just another debugging tool that I use quite a bit. You can also use the console log. That's another great one. I just know that I've seen this quite a bit, and actually I've seen it not even just in debugging more advanced things where I'm switching back and forth between a JavaScript object and a JavaScript object notation. So a JavaScript object with a JSON, you use this stringify, and then if you want to go the other way, it's called parse. So parse actually goes and takes a string and it'll parse your object. So those are key ones that you'll see when dealing with JSON. So let's go back to this. There we go. Another thing that I want to show you, you don't have to do it this way, but you could separate these out. So I have a div here. And let's say that I wanted to put the image as a separate thing. I don't know why it did that. What I could do here, inside this, it says set the it only grabs the destination. So I need to do another one of these. My whole purpose of this is I want to, maybe you want to separate the name and the image. Maybe you want to separate those because they're in two different locations. Maybe one's in a totally different spot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to assign this to be its own. So now I have this document element planet image. It might be self-closing. I want to make it look good. I also got to keep the styling right. So I need to do style height of 250. See how it has the closing here? Like it, I don't know. I'm used to seeing a closing tag, but you may not need it. Right. So again, I'm trying to make it so that if I want to, I can make the planet name and the image in different locations and have like some kind of break in there. Does it have it? Oh, okay. There we go. So maybe I want to put something else inside the planet, but not have the image in the same location. So I'm separating this out. I'm just doing the same thing. I said, let's create an image. I'm going to grab this ID. When the destination is clicked, let's go ahead and change that inner thing to that. Let's also change my image dot source to be, I got rid of it. I think this works. There we go. The style didn't come along with it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that right this second. I know it'll be some trial and error, but I want to keep going. So I hope this at least makes a little bit of sense that you can do more than just set an inner HTML. You can set a source. You can set different things that you want here. I'm almost positive, I just don't know it off the top of my head, that you can set the styles. You can set the styles to this. There we go. Just didn't put pixels afterwards. So there's that. So you can do other things. I still am going to talk about the index. That's going to be one of the last things. Oh, let's say I don't want to click on this. I don't want to click on that. I think it's dumb. So I want to actually create a button that goes to the next one. Let's do that. Let's go down here underneath the image, or I'm going to make it at the top. Let's create a button. Since I want to manipulate it, if I don't want to manipulate the button, I don't have to assign it an ID, but because I do want to manipulate it and put an event listener on it, I want to definitely create an ID. Forgot the there are some syntax things here that I think you're supposed to put the tag type first and then what it is, but I can't remember off the top of my head, so don't quote me on that. But let's go up here and let's say button. And then my ID is going to be button planet. And now this is when you click the destination. I don't want that. I want to, when you click the button. But I think everything else I can just keep the same. I think all of the stuff inside the function is working. It's just now I'm changing so that the listener is not on the destination. The listener is on the button. Oh, but I didn't put a text on the button. Let's see. Next planet. There we go. So now when I click on any of this, nothing happens. But when I click on this, it does what I want. I think that was all that I was going to show on that. And so then I'll end it with the index. Let's see if this is self-closing. To be honest, there's a lot of things that are self-closing because JavaScript just does, or HTML just does what it thinks. But yeah, image still works without a closing tag. So there you go. Yes, you can pass something in the stringify. I did post that somewhere. Yes, there are other manipulations to that. So yeah, definitely copy and paste from what I put. Yeah, I knew the break was self-closing. Right. Right. So the index. The best thing to do here. Right. I think I'm going to try to explain this and then I'll show you what the console log looks like. So if I got rid of this, I'll put it back here in a second. So my index starts off to be 0. That means it grabs the 0, the first element, because remember 0-based index. It grabs the first element inside JSON and grabs the name, and it grabs the image of the first element, which is a 0-based index. And then every time I click, so every time I click, because it's inside this thing, it doesn't look very good inside that thing, but it is inside that function there. Every time I click, it's going to add 1 to the index. So then when it goes through here again, now it's going to be 1, and then it's going to be 2, and then it's going to be 3, and then it's going to be 4. The problem is if I don't have that, eventually, once it gets to this 6th one, it doesn't have a 7th element. It doesn't have an index of 6. So it's like, hey, I can't do that. There's nothing there. Something's wrong. So I think most people are okay on that logic there. The difference here, I could say if index is greater than or equal to JSON.length then make index equal 0 or something like this. I could probably do this, maybe. Yeah. So I could do this right here. What I'm doing is every single time it gets to 5, well, when it tries to do 6, it says, hey, that's the length. I'm going to set you back to 0. And this works. The difference with the modulus is it just uses, it does not reset the index. And actually it does reset the index because it resets it here. Yeah. Right. So here what I did, I created another variable that we don't need. It's mainly for visibility. That's all I'm doing this for. Every time you click, it's going to go up and it's always going to go up forever. That's the purpose of this number clicked. And then I am printing it out. So Index is 0, number clicked is 0. This makes sense so far. Since the length is 6, so let's think about numbers here. 5 plus 1 mod 6. 5 plus 1 is 6. 6 mod 6. So 6 divided by 6, what's the remainder? When you divide a number by itself, it's going to reset this thing back to 0. And so even though I clicked it 12 times, it resets it back to 0 because every single time it gets up to 6, 6 mod 6 is 0. So it'll reset it back to 0. That's the shortcut. This you'll see all over the place when you're dealing with numbers. So hopefully I showed you at least a way earlier. I showed you a way of doing, like, if the index is the length of the length, then just set it back to 0. That's one way to do it. And if you do it that way, nobody's going to be upset with you. But I will be honest, once you get higher up in coding, you will see this more often. They will want this. Nobody will be upset with the other way. It's just they'll make you fix it. So again, there's multiple ways to do a lot of this stuff. Right. Now I think I'm done with this. Any other questions on this? I do want to show you one other thing and something different. While loop would not be a good suggestion on this. When you click, remember, technically there's no loop here. I do want to emphasize that. This is event-driven architecture, meaning your event is your click. So you're not actually, a loop is not events. A loop loops through everything all at the same time, not per click. This is a per click, and you only want to go to the next one each click. So we're not going to put an actual loop here. Your click kind of is your loop, per se. Let's see if there's any other questions. So there was I'm fine with off-topic questions. So how close are we to being able to make a button run from the mouse, to keep it from being clicked? Yeah, that's unfortunately, we won't actually go over that in this class, course. But yes, please, you have enough information to Google it, because what you would do is you would do button, like whenever this says click. Well, do you want to do it when it clicks that you can't click it anymore? I mean, there's so many other things of, like, well, when do you want it to happen? But you can do a button dot and then find the thing, the keyword or the method that's going to disable that button. And whatever that is, you just copy and paste it into here, and you have all the other knowledge. So if you're wanting to do that, you should have enough knowledge to be able to copy and paste it and put it in. Right. I'm going to show you. I'm going to preface this. I went to 2 different joke sites for APIs to show you some random stuff. I think some of the jokes are funny, but I can say that every once in a while, whenever I show some of these, they may or may not be what I would consider appropriate. So if I see one, I'll click it as fast as I can to get to the next one. But I think you do have to be over 18 to be in LaunchCode. So I don't think there's any legal things. And any joke that appears on here, I'll say the disclaimer, is not supported by me nor LaunchCode. Yeah. Just throwing that out there. Okay, so there's two different ones. I'll show you. There's this Chuck Norris API. So I'm going to show you what I did first. I went and I just Googled APIs that I can use. And there are some. I actually want to, if I have time for next one, I want to show you the Open API one, the Open Weather. So what I did was I just Googled APIs, and there's this Chuck Norris jokes. And it says, I know this is so small, you don't need to be able to read everything, but if you use this URL, you can actually retrieve jokes, and it's in a JSON format, et cetera, et cetera. So I looked through here and I was like, oh, let me just throw out and just make or have it display random jokes. And I was like, that's fine. Another one that I did was this joke API. So I'm going to show off this one a little bit too, but it's a similar type of thing. The cool thing about these, I don't have to create an account. I don't have to create anything. These are free open APIs, so you can do that. What I do want to show you that you can do, YouTube has a data API. So if you click on this, I do want to show you, whenever you get into real APIs that you don't create, or even that you create, there has to be a security layer. And so it's very, very typical for an API for you to create an account. So obviously I have a Google account. And then you actually have to create some kind of authorization credentials. And then you have to use the authentication guide to make sure that it knows you are who you say you are. So usually APIs have some kind of, you usually just can't call them. You have to more or less sign in. But remember, you're used to signing in using username and password. And so you're used to using a GUI to sign in, where a computer talking to another computer, they don't do that. They don't type in a username and type in a password. So they need to know how to talk to each other, and that they know who you are. So oftentimes there's tokens that they do. So a client token, a client ID with other credentials. So it is kind of like GitHub authentication. Whenever your VS Code wants to talk to GitHub, you had to type in and get a token, an API token. So that is very, very typical, that you create an account, you have to copy down what it says. The whole reason I'm bringing this up is because some people are still a little confused about what is API. And if you're thinking about it in specifics of, well, every API does this, that's absolutely wrong. An API is just a vague term of how you interface with whatever you want to interface with. So for me to interface with this joke API, I have to go to this URL. I can click some different things, and it tells me how to interact with it. That's an open one. But oftentimes, such as this YouTube one, you have to do some extra work. All of that is under the umbrella of Google or YouTube API or joke API. So API is just the rules that service is set in place for you to interact with it. So API is very broad of a term. So it's very hard to, one of the most common entry-level development questions, because most people have trouble explaining it, is they'll ask you in an interview, what is an API? You're going to have to be able to answer that. And the easiest way to answer that is just like a set of rules that allow one service to connect to another service and use the data, or collect the data, not use it. Because once I get it, then I use it however I want to. But how do I get the data from another service? And that's the API. And unfortunately, every API is slightly different. So you'll have to go into, well, there's ones that make you register and authenticate. There's some that are open. There's all these different varieties. So I'm going to show off this a little bit. So these are where I got this, and just so you know. Okay, I have the Chuck Norris one already uncommented. These should look very similar to what I did before. I'm waiting until everything loads. I'm fetching from this random. There's a function that has a response. This response JSON, I'm going to change it to a JSON. I have a div from Chuck Norris. I've literally copied and pasted exactly what I showed you before and changed some variables. That's all I did for this. I didn't come up with almost any of this. I tried to set an image, but when I did the image, the image doesn't work. That's because the image is old. It's like from 4 years ago and somebody lost it or something. And then this is where I was showing off that stringify. I'll show you, I'm going to change this in a second. And then the actual HTML is down here. I have an H1 and H2. I have an image, but does not work right now. And then Chuck Norris. So I'm going to show this off real quick. And it shows this, which is the whole entire thing. This allows me to say, well, what key do I want? Well, I don't want categories. I don't want created at. I actually want the value. So that helps me go back here and say, okay, I don't want all of this JSON. I just want the JSON dot value. That's what I want. So then it displays the joke here. Chuck Norris is what nightmares have nightmares about. So again, the image doesn't work because if I actually go to the URL, it doesn't show it. Like I went to this, it should be showing it, but it doesn't. That's because this Chuck Norris API is old. So hopefully you can see that I can do it with almost anything. The other thing that the book doesn't show you that I do want to show you, I am not a fan of once I have so many scripts in here, that they're all in here. So I'm going to actually take my scripts and I'm going to remove them from here. I don't like them in my HTML. I want to get rid of them. So I'm going to cut this. So this is just HTML. I'm actually going to go over to my JavaScript file and paste all that, but then get rid of the HTML tags because I don't need HTML tags. I'll come back to that. All right. Because this is coming from another API, I am going to put this in my HTML. If I don't put it in here, then I have to do some kind of require something. So the joke API, I had it up here a little bit ago. It says, hey, if you want to use our API, you can hit the URL, or we're going to give you some fancy code and you just copy and paste. So I can set the joke type here. So this one looks a little different. So I'm going to show it off just a little bit. I could take the joke API. That's what I had to do. All right. Here, well, this might not work. We'll see. So I have this joke API and I said get jokes, but I want the joke type to be single jokes, meaning not multiple jokes, not like they can send them in pairs and stuff like that. Then I'm going to take do you see how it's just R? I copied and pasted this from their documentation. This is not me doing this. This is some professional on their side. They just did R and then R JSON, and then take the data that you get and you're going to update the UI. I do kind of like this. So instead of having this document.getElementById and having it inside here, they created a separate function. This is smart because what if I wanted to update not only the joke API, but what if I wanted to update my Chuck Norris API at the same time? I can do that with just this function. I could pass in, you see how this has it hard coded by ID, but I could not have to hard code this ID, and I could have an ID that I throw in. So there are multiple ways to program this where I can be more flexible. Let's see if this actually works though. I don't think it's going to. And the reason, well, I know one reason why. This HTML here does not know about my JavaScript over here. So anytime I have JavaScript, I do have to say that I want to use it. So I'm going to use the script tag. The source is going to be, that's what I put it in, the class 16 JavaScript. I'm going to end it. All right, so now something else. Yeah, I have no clue what that means. So, so this is the actual joke. This is the joke text. And then the Chuck Norris is after it. That's why the joke is here. Even though in JavaScript, it doesn't really matter which one's which. This was looking a lot better earlier. I have no clue. These are not very funny. I don't know why they have these. So do you need a reference? Do you need to reference your API in your HTML and your JavaScript? And you do not. So the Chuck Norris one, I am not referencing in my HTML at all. My HTML, this specific thing, I could do, remember how we've done like the require? So I could do, that's where I might get a little bit too off task here, but I would do something like this. Remember the require thing? I need to do that to use this one, and I think it's at this place. I think. I haven't done it on my own, so I don't want to spend too much time if it doesn't work. But this joke API, it actually is getting declared through this script right here. So I could do a require and get it, but yep. This line doesn't actually do anything, but the code stops working when I delete it. There you go. Okay. I hope you had a little bit of fun with this. Let me know if you have any actual questions on the code. I think I'm in the recording.